My name is Lian Sifuentes. I'm the Academic Programs Coordinator here at the Brooklyn Museum, and I'd just like to thank you very much for coming to our costume symposium entitled Costume Collections, a Collaborative Model for Museums. This afternoon's panel is a behind-the-scenes look at the inner workings of the costume collection. Please take this moment to silence your cell phones. Go ahead and silence your cell phones. Thank you. With that, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Jan Reeder, Consulting Curator for the Brooklyn Museum.
And it is my absolute pleasure to introduce our first speaker, who I think that many of you now feel you've already been introduced to via the photographs. She is Liz Fiorentino, was the collections manager. And Liz, prior to her work on the costume project, was at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, where she held the position of collections care specialist. She holds an MFA from the Department of Fiber at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and a BFA in sculpture from the School of Art and Design at Alfred University. So I hand the podium over to you, Liz.
Thanks, everyone, for being here. It's an honor to be here. I'm going to briefly introduce to you our process that took place over 3 years. I'm going to touch upon the start of the project, the move from the Brooklyn Museum to the offsite warehouse, and our method for processing the collection. I'll also make a brief note about processing the Charles James material. At the start of the project, there were 3 main unknowns influencing our planning strategies. First, we didn't know how many objects there were. As Jan mentioned, we estimated it to be about 27,000. Second, we didn't know the content of the collection. We knew about the select objects and collections that were well documented over the years, but we would all be seeing everything for the first time. Third, we didn't know how to find anything with precision. The majority of the locations of the objects were unknown. We had a general sense of what types of garments and accessories were stored where, but we needed to build a retrievable system from scratch. Once we completed the move, we would have the unique opportunity of having everything in one dedicated space, the entire collection, the permanent accession records, and flexible access to the database. The first step was the move. As Jan mentioned earlier, the collection was stored by object type in 9 different storage areas in various containers, and these are images of various storerooms. Most garments were hanging on stationary racks or on rolling garment carts. Many garments were also stored in large dress boxes. Accessories were stored in hundreds of boxes of varying sizes. Many hats and shoes were stored on open shelves, and other garments and accessories were layered in cabinet drawers. This is the storeroom that was the most challenging to evacuate. It held mid to late 20th century garments hanging on stationary poles, ordered by decade and then by designer. This order was retained as garments were loaded onto empty garment carts that had been previously purchased for the move. The image on the right shows a cart being filled, and as Kevin mentioned earlier, the storeroom was only accessible by a narrow staircase, so a hole had to be made in the ceiling, and the carts were lowered down on a mechanical lift. In the image on the left, a cart is about to be lowered down to the floor below, with a label indicating the cart number, which was pinned to the outside. Each cart was given a number in successive order. This allowed us to rebuild the original storage order once we were in the new space. Assigning container numbers was also a way to manage the collection in bulk, and secondary to the object number became our main system for tracking the collection. On the right is an image of a cart suspended from the lift, as seen from below. In total, we unloaded 2,800 garments onto 114 carts. In the image on the left are garment carts loaded with large dress boxes. We were lucky that the 60-inch boxes fit perfectly onto extra empty garment carts. This became an unexpectedly efficient transport method. Each box had already been assigned a container number, and similar to the carts, this became our way to track the objects inside. In the image on the right, hats are being loaded into temporary boxes, which would then be boxed again for transport. This is a list of everything that moved off-site. The image shows a trailer truck loaded with garment carts. And as Jan mentioned, it took 11 days to move to the off-site facility. In total, there were 12 runs with a 48-foot trailer truck and 3 runs with a 24-foot truck. We had 15,000 square feet in the new space, and these are the 12 areas or rooms we created to store and process the collection, in addition to office space. Containers were loaded in first by container type, either a cart, box, or cabinet, and then by object type. Each room, shelving unit, and cabinet drawer was assigned a number and/or letter combination, creating more than 500 unique locations. These were loaded into the database and became our system for storing and retrieving objects once processing was complete. As Jan introduced this morning, we created workflow procedures to process the collection. I'm going to talk about 4 stages: preparation for cataloging, photography, and return to a home location. Though the storage formats varied and the logistics evolved as we encountered different types of objects, the process essentially remained the same throughout the project. During each quarter of our 3-year schedule, objects were retrieved from storage in the order of our plan. It was decided ahead of time how to phase each object grouping, either by designer, date, function, such as uniforms, or type, such as neckwear. If an object type was in more than one type of container, such as hats being on both shelves and in boxes, one container type was processed first from start to finish, and then the other type. A tag was created for each object in the container, listing designer or date range, accession number, and each component part. The accession number was searched in the database to make sure the record corresponded to the object. If needed, the accession book was checked to clear up any minor number or description discrepancies. If there was a major discrepancy, the object was set aside for further research. If an object was unable to be identified by a variety of methods, it was assigned a temporary CP number. The container number was then recorded in the database and a temporary location assigned. Since most collection items did not have an existing location, this became the first time the objects were officially tracked. A checklist with object number, title, date, designer, and location was printed for each container. Preparing and annotating a physical checklist became our way to track where an object was at all times within the processing stages. As objects were cataloged, the tags were marked with the curatorial status, special, regular collection, or deaccession recommended. Empty containers with pre-assigned numbers were made available for sorting these objects. The research assistant would then annotate the checklist with the curatorial status and new container numbers and give the completed list to me. If there were any object number changes based on a thorough comparing of the object with the database and the accession books, these were also noted on the checklist. As containers became full, they were separated in the staging area according to the 2 types of photography needed, either special or access, and they were marked cataloging complete. I would then update the new container numbers, assign another temporary location if necessary, print a new checklist, and mark the container ready for photography. The photographer would then retrieve the readied container and copy the checklist so that the date of each image could be recorded, which you can see in the image on the right. If any number or location discrepancies were discovered during photography, these were also recorded on the checklist. After photography, the finished list was given to me and the container tagged photography complete. After photography, I would then update the database with any changes or corrections. I would then assign a home location, update it in the database, print a new list, and return the container to storage. And here are a few images of completed containers with an object list. As much as possible, like material was stored together by status. Deaccessions were kept in one area, and regular collection and special items were either interspersed or kept separate, depending on the material and storage method. These images show a few ways containers were labeled to indicate the content inside, some generated with images from the completed database records. I had to include this image because it shows the 3 progressive stages of our cataloging in such a low-tech way. But it worked. What was not so low-tech, and which we like to call was diabolical, were my spreadsheets. For each quarter, I kept a list of each object type that was being processed. In this example, it shows both objects that are in cabinets, boxes, and garment carts. The list indicates the home location, the content, and the processing stages that had been completed. Keeping track of the object count was also important and was consistently compared to our initial object count to make sure that we were on track with what we had projected we needed to catalog. As our quarters progressed, the phasing between what was being cataloged and what was being shot in the photography studios was no longer in alignment. This was often due to the photo setup, since it made more sense to shoot by the current setup rather than by the cataloging order. The result being that an object cataloged in quarter 6 may not have been photographed until quarter 8. The James collection was well documented in the 1982 Charles James exhibition at the Brooklyn Museum and the accompanying book, The Genius of Charles James by Elizabeth Ann Coleman. Many garments came into the collection with sewn muslins and flat patterns that were used in the process of creating the garment. We also had almost 400 sketches, some of which related to specific garments. Because so much preliminary research had been done, we had the unique opportunity of being able to study the supporting material and fully document and cross-reference it. In some cases, this involved updating the accession numbers to both individualize and connect the related material. And in the image on the right shows the paper patterns stored in portfolio boxes. The image on the right shows one of the paper patterns fully laid out. Using the related records feature in the database, we were able to cross-reference related garments and the supporting muslins, patterns, and sketches for each garment. This screen is showing an object record of a ball gown. The upper half shows the ball gown, and the lower half shows the related material. To the right is a record of a muslin, and to the left are all of the other associated garments and patterns. Many garments had a model number and/or a specific name, which was entered into each relevant record. In the end, we were able to answer our 3 unknowns. We cataloged 23,821 objects in total, almost evenly split between garments and accessories. Every item was located, and here is an approximate breakdown of the numbers by method. Also in the end, the 3 places to record the unique number of each object, the object tag, the accession record, and the database all said the same thing. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Plata Grace Hernandez, known to us as Grace, who was the assistant curator of the project. She oversaw the integrity of all the TMS records and reviewed the continuity of the cataloging process, as well as supporting me in all ways. Prior to her working on the project, she was at the Antonio Ratti Textile Center at the Metropolitan Museum, and also has been for quite some time a proofreader at the New Yorker magazine. She holds a BA in English from the University of Pennsylvania and an MA in Museum Studies with an emphasis in Palladium textiles from SUNY, of the Fashion Institute of Technology. So she is going to talk. I mentioned before that one of the great joys of the project was being able to record every letter, every comma, every dot on the labels in the garments. And so this her report will be some of the results of that task.
Good afternoon. I wanted to thank the Brooklyn Museum of Art and the Metropolitan Museum of Art for allowing me to participate in this symposium and to talk about what I learned from labels. My research was sparked by geography. The costume documentation project was based on Fulton Street in downtown Brooklyn, on a retail strip dense with fast food chains, discount stores, and specialty shops. Like much in New York City, businesses in the area were built over the bones of past ventures. These retail ghosts were all around us. The more objects in the collection we cataloged, the more often we encountered pieces with a downtown Brooklyn origin. It became clear to us that the collection had a Brooklyn story, but where to begin? The first step in uncovering that story was to compile a list of Brooklyn garment makers and retailers. Out of the more than 23,000 objects we cataloged, about 212 contain Brooklyn labels. Some have just a maker's name and Brooklyn, others include both a name and street address. When I combine the names and addresses with garment and accessory dates, a picture of the garment trade from the late 19th to the early 20th century began to appear. My research on this topic is ongoing, but I've taken some of my findings to date and plotted them on this partial map of Brooklyn. Before I talk about this map and share some of what I learned from labels, I'd like to provide you with an extremely short history of Brooklyn. What we call Brooklyn was originally 5 settlements created by the Dutch during the mid-17th century. One was named Brooklyn. The settlements came under British control by the end of that century and became part of Kings County. The large tracts of farmland that comprised Brooklyn were largely unchanged throughout the 18th century, except, of course, the changes in governance brought about by the American Revolution. In 1814, Robert Fulton created a steam engine that made passage up the eastern Hudson rivers relatively fast and economically feasible. It also made travel across the river much easier, and New York City businessmen welcomed the opportunity to establish comfortable homes or weekend retreats on the rise of land known as Brooklyn Heights. Heights landowners were equally happy to subdivide their land into profitable lots for these first suburban commuters. The resulting expansion in population created a pocket of business opportunities in the area, which in time would expand east. Fulton Street, the former Ferry Road and Jamaica Pass, the thick pink serpentine line that starts at the waterfront on the upper left of this map and cuts through the center, was a well-traveled route that became a magnet for commerce. The red dots on the map indicate makers and retailers in the collection who were working from the 1830s to the 1880s. The blue dots indicate those dating from the 1890s and later. As you can see, a significant number of businesses were located on or near Fulton Street. The earliest Brooklyn maker identified in the collection, James Mitchell, was located in Brooklyn Heights. This suit, made by Mitchell, dates from between 1830 to 1840. According to the jacket label, it was made at 80 Montague Street. By the third quarter of the 19th century, individual makers, like Mitchell, were competing with the grand department stores. In the 1890s, Fulton Street was home to the 2 largest department stores in the city, Abraham and Straus and Frederick Lozier. Both stores are gone, but their buildings remain. Since 1995, the A&S building has been home to Macy's, and from 2005 to early 2009, the Frederick Lozier building was the home of the Brooklyn Museum Costume Documentation Project. Frederick Lozier and Company was a Brooklyn fixture for nearly 100 years. Founded in 1860 as Lozier and Dinkelspiel, it started as an embroidery and trimmings business at 277 Fulton Street. Today, that would be about 2 blocks from Borough Hall. By 1870, Lozier had bought out his partner and established a larger store at Fulton and Tillery Streets. Today, that's the entrance to the Brooklyn Bridge. By 1887, Lozier had moved into a new 5-story building at 484 Fulton Street. Shown here by the purple dot, it stood between Fulton and Livingston Streets and Bond Street and Fulton Alley. 3 floors were dedicated to sales, the 4th floor held administrative offices, and the top was reserved for washrooms, ladies' fitting departments, and rooms for buyer samples. The new building had every modern convenience, including elevators, electric lights, and telephone service. 7 years later, Logers expanded again, constructing an annex that extended to Elm Place. Logers also unveiled a pneumatic tube payment system. To complete a sale, clerks placed documents and cash in a small capsule. The capsule then rode a cushion of air through the pipes that led directly to the cashier's department where the transaction was completed. And I spent 3.5 years desperately trying to find those pipes. Logers' main store and its branches remained popular into the 20th century, but by the 1950s, its prosperity cooled. In February 1952, the Fulton Street store and all but one branch were closed. Logers' name was acquired by longtime neighbor A.I. Nam. 5 years later, Nam's decided to focus on its suburban stores, and the Nam Logers store closed as well. Big department stores like Logers not only sold goods, they provided services. Dressmaking was one of the services Logers offered its customers, but some patrons would buy their dress goods at Logers and then take them to their own dressmaker. The wearer of this 1893 wedding dress did just that. The fabric came from Logers, where it cost an impressive sum of $10 a yard. After buying the fabric, she bypassed the Loger workrooms and instead took a short walk to Mrs. A.B. Cody's establishment at 23 Elm Place. Mrs. Cody's name and address are marked on the garment's inner waistband. Thanks to the Brooklyn Public Library's online archive of the Brooklyn Daily Eagle newspaper and digitized census records available through Heritage Quest, I've been able to create a sketch of Mrs. Cody's life and work. Cody operated a dressmaking business from about the 1880s to the 1900s. Her longevity is notable, and her reasons for working clear. According to the 1880 census, Irish-born Mrs. Cody was a 33-year-old widow and the mother of 2 young boys. She had 3 downtown business locations over time. According to the Eagle, she was located at 303 Fulton in the early 1880s, then at 305 Fulton in 1884, both approximately near Borough Hall. By 1893, she was on Elm Place, shown here by the green dot. By the late 1890s, she had moved her business to 213 Cumberland Street in nearby Fort Greene. Cody was successful enough to afford a first-hand look at European fashion. According to sailing notices published in the Eagle, she made 4 trips to Europe between 1893 and 1900. Her sons, 25 and 21 at the time, accompanied her on the latter trip. The trio toured Europe, traveling to London, Boulogne, Lucerne, Interlaken, Geneva, and finally Paris in the 1900 exposition. These initial glimpses of Cody's life and work offer tantalizing looks at a Fulton Street business. Equally compelling is the story of her rival and almost neighbor, Herbert Louis. Herbert Louis advertised himself as a man dressmaker or ladies' tailor. 17 of his creations were cataloged during the project. They date from 1880 to 1915 and reflect a long career. Louis turned out day dresses, wedding dresses, outerwear, and sporting wear, as well as evening dresses like the circa 1890 gown shown here. Garment labels place his workrooms at 17 Elm Place in the 1880s and 202 Washington Park in the 1890s and early 1900s. Louis was not only ambitious in the scope of what he produced, but also in his search for new clients. By the turn of the century, he had extended his business beyond Brooklyn. Garment labels from that time refer to a New York location. He had opened a business at 303 Fifth Avenue in Manhattan. Situated near 31st Street, the business site was steps from Macy's, B. Altman, and Best & Company, 3 major New York City department stores. But Louis' business roots were in Brooklyn, and this 1914 dress, made in his Fort Greene workroom, is associated with the devoted Brooklyn patron, Amelia Beard Hollenbach. Hollenbach, the daughter of a prominent businessman and philanthropist, John Wells Hollenbach, was a resident of Clinton Hill and a notable donor to the Brooklyn Museum collection. She peppered her contributions with invaluable first-person information. Her links to Louis opened the door to another avenue of investigation, the relationship between the dressmaker and his customer, and another means of learning from labels. As you can see, the Brooklyn Museum costume collection at the Metropolitan Museum of Art is a significant resource, not only for the study and appreciation of costume, but also for the associations they reveal. By looking at the labels in the collection, we can begin to assemble a picture of the makers and retailers on Fulton Street and in downtown Brooklyn, and to reconstruct the stories behind the people and the businesses whose skillful work is worthy of our consideration. Thank you.
I wanted to say, too, that Grace has been chosen as the Polaire Weissman Fellow, correct? With the first award related to the Brooklyn Museum collection at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So she will be continuing this research into the work of American designers over the course of the next year. Our next speaker is Katie Netherton, who was one of the research assistants, and she has an MA from New York University in visual culture, costume studies, and a BA from Baylor University in fashion merchandising. And Katie is going to tell us about who we believe is a very unappreciated and was a very important player at the Brooklyn Museum and in the costume collection. So come on up, Katie.
Hello, thanks for having me. Michelle Murphy acted as the research consultant and curator of the Edward C. Blum Design Laboratory from its inception in 1948 to her death in 1954. The Design Lab was a significant period of the Brooklyn Museum's history and thrived from 1948 to 1968. It was opened as a memorial to Edward Charles Blum, who, along with the Brooklyn Museum ethnology curator Stuart Cullen and women's wear design editor Morris DeCamp Crawford, collaborated for more than 30 years to develop a mutually beneficial relationship between museums and the industrial art and design industries. Murphy, because of her devotion to inspiring new design ideas, was absolutely critical to the success of the lab. Born in 1907 and raised in New York, Michelle was trained in art education at Hunter College and Columbia University. She began working in the museum's education department in 1932. Throughout the 30s, she worked with the costume and textile collection off and on, and her passion for the design industry took off. By 1940, Murphy was the supervisor of the industrial division, which oversaw the costume and textile collection. In preparation for this new role, Murphy worked diligently with MDC Crawford for 2 years to understand all the aspects of the industry. She went to mills, factories, shops, and workrooms, learning everything from weave structures to how a design became reality. When World War II started, and Paris was once again cut off from America, as it was in World War I, she ardently took on the new wave of American designers who needed inspiration. Murphy is described in many positive ways, but the common denominator that seems to run across all the descriptions is her vibrant, dynamic personality. She was passionate about the museum's relationship with industry and about the design process in particular. She is described as being, quote, gifted with enthusiasm, and she showed an utter loyalty to the museum and the Design Lab's members. Most of all, she held an intense conviction of the dignity and worth of the museum's collections as a source of inspiration, and she held a knowledge of those collections museum-wide that was described as encyclopedic. The lab's basic mission was to originate and nurture design ideas. This is an advertising brochure for the lab. Murphy specifically did this by cultivating relationships with the lab's members, which were professionals from various types of companies, ranging from yarn companies to theatrical and film production companies. Members had full aspect to the museum's collections, not just the costume and textiles, but also the vast library holdings. The lab's staff, Here's Michelle sitting down, and then the woman standing up is Dorothy Tricarico, who also worked at the lab, was spearheaded by Murphy, and when presented with requests, or design problems, as they were called, brought forth examples and suggestions from the museum's collections, and then sequestered the objects until the project was complete, ensuring absolute confidentiality. Here is Michelle with an employee from the fabric firm Gailey & Lord. The goal was always to inspire new ideas and designs from the examination of objects from the past, never a line-by-line adaptation of what had already been done. As Charles James said of her, she had the talent to help designers see the potential they had within themselves to create something new. Among her duties, Murphy was responsible for organizing exhibitions that, in her own words, traced changes in design and technology from the handcraft level to current mechanization. Two of these shows include Nothing to Wear in 1940 and 5,000 Years of Fibers and Fabrics in 1946, both of which were intended as general overviews of fashion history and were meant as inspiration for design and industry professionals. In 1948, Murphy planned the inaugural exhibition for the newly opened design lab, which Jan mentioned earlier, called Decade of Design, which exclusively featured the Charles James wardrobe, muslins, and patterns of Standard Oil heiress and style icon Millicent Rogers. Here's a picture from that. Notice that the mannequin's head is shaped after Millicent Rogers' head. The exhibition is especially important to note because it's proof of the design lab's and Michelle Murphy's influence and her relationship with a specific designer. Among all the museums in New York, Charles James, through one of his most devoted clients, Mrs. Rogers, who in his words inspired him to do his best work, had decided that the Brooklyn Museum was the best place for his work, not only to be cared for, but to be available for study and inspiration for students and designers. The Brooklyn Museum wasn't the only museum that had a study room set up for designers to view collection material, but the Design Lab was unique in its proactive, service-oriented attitude and specialized, personalized approach to solving designers' design questions. This reputation was largely established by Murphy's mission to nurture designers' work and her desire to provide a destination for inspiration. Murphy also represented the Brooklyn Museum and the Design Lab in the community, in both Brooklyn and Manhattan. She lectured at area design schools such as Pratt Institute and Parsons, for retailing firms such as Tobey Coburn, and at monthly trend talks for the Designers Research Group. She presided over fashion shows at the museum and at other locations using museum objects, made television appearances, and participated in radio shows relating to the museum, its collection, and the Design Lab. She authored many articles on the collection and textile and fashion history in general for magazines, newspapers, and the American People's Encyclopedia. In order to serve the lab's members to the best of her ability, Murphy was required to stay apprised of trends in the markets that she serviced. As part of that effort, and in order to cultivate relationships, she was a member of many industry organizations such as the Fashion Group, Home Fashions League, Inner Circle, and Society of New York Dress Designers. But she wasn't just a member. She was an officer of the Fashion Group, served on their committee about the millinery trade, was invited to speak at chapters around the country, and was nominated for vice president in 1953. For the Society of New York Dress Designers, she served on the advisory board along with M.D.C. Crawford and luminaries such as fashion editor Carmel Snow. She gave lectures for society members at the museum, wrote articles for their monthly bulletin, and assisted with their fashion shows by providing information about certain historical periods and making appointments at the lab for members. She served as a representative for museums for the Inner Circle, but she was particularly interested in encouraging new designers, and as such, served on committees at educational institutions. She served as a member of the Trustees Committee on Education for Rhode Island School of Design, and as an advisor to the Department of Design and Weaving at the Lowell Textile Institute. Because of this tireless work in the field, she became very well known, and in 1951 was given the Neiman Marcus Award, or Fashion Industry Oscar as it was known, in recognition for her work at the Design Lab. In grand Neiman Marcus style, the press release announcing the winners that year recognized Michelle as establishing the greatest fashion laboratory in the Western Hemisphere. During the festivities surrounding the award, 10 objects from the Brooklyn Museum were shown, including the Gratitude Train dolls, which Jessica will tell you about, that were featured in the windows of Neiman's downtown Dallas flagship store, which is the big deal. According to one article about the award, Murphy, quote, made the Brooklyn Museum not a house of the old, but the inspiration of the new. Murphy's energetic pull and her own personal knowledge of the collections at the Brooklyn Museum combined to make the Design Lab widely known throughout the U.S. as a source of fashion history and knowledge, but also for promoting American design ingenuity. Because of this reputation, an influx of donations poured into the museum from designers and non-designers alike, not only during Murphy's lifetime, but long after her untimely death at the age of 47 in August of 1954. American designers who donated during her tenure and kept on donating after her death include Charles James, Carolyn Schnurr, Bonnie Cashin, Vera Maxwell, Madame Etta, Vera Newman, Elizabeth Hawes, milliner Sally Victor, which you'll see some of her designs here, and shoe and accessory designer Stephen Arpad. Companies also donated, including Edgar Hyman Company, which is better known as Echo Scarfs, and Delman Shoes. Non-designer donors, such as Vogue editor Babs Simpson, socialites Mercedes de Acosta for her sister Rita Leidig, Millicent Rogers, and here's just a few of her many pieces of clothing that are in the collection, and Dominique de Menil also gave family heirlooms and personal wardrobes. As at other museums in the city, these donations were given to be studied for design inspiration. But at the Brooklyn Museum, a significant reason for giving was the donors' relationship with and respect for Murphy and the Design Lab. Her ability to network with members of each sector of the fashion industry and her passionate personality allowed the lab to be as important to the industry as it was for almost 20 years. In 1955, a year after her death, Murphy was memorialized with an inspiration gala chaired by Stanley Marcus of Neiman Marcus and William Gayley Lord, the head of major fabric firm Gayley & Lord, Inc. The evening honored the distinguished and valiant servant with dinner, dancing, a musical skit, exhibits of designs by lab members, and a carnival with prizes. Many important members of the design community were involved in the evening, including textile designers Dorothy Liebs and Tamis Keefe, designers Carolyn Schnurr, Nettie Rosenstein, Adele Simpson, Madame Etta, and Bonnie Cashin, Fleur Cowles of Flair magazine, Lord & Taylor president Dorothy Shaver, milliner Sally Victor, fashion journalist Eugenia Shepard, Carmel Snow, Kay Carr, and Babs Simpson, and publicist Eleanor Lambert. The lab used proceeds from the gala, assisted by donations that were solicited by friends such as Charles James and Eleanor Lambert, to dedicate a Michelle Murphy memorial room in the lab in 1956, which catered to architecture and interior design professionals. Another testament to her long-lasting influence, 13 years after her death in 1967, FIT's exhibition of Elizabeth Hawes and Rudy Gernreich's designs was, according to Robert Riley, who headed the design lab at FIT, a memorial to her. Upon Murphy's death, Charles James wrote a moving tribute to her, which evidences the depth of their relationship, saying that she paralleled no one he had ever met in or out of the fashion world. He wrote, quote, "The extraordinary prestige connected with the name of Michelle Murphy came from her absolute integrity of spirit, her complete lack of prejudice, and her passion for sharing discovery and enlightenment." He also wrote of her capacity and thirst for knowledge, saying, "Her knowledge came through an intense desire to find out, through reason, instinct, and energy, all there was to know about anything met, and once gained was classified in her mind so that at any moment it could be drawn on for the benefit of anybody who turned to her." He admired, and I think that it's fair to say, loved her understanding of the designer's work, and ends with saying this: "Michelle Murphy had nothing to give that the world would judge of material value, no rewards, prizes, or privileges. But artists do wonderfully well with none of these. While the spirit shared, the effort understood, the goal anticipated, the fight shared, These are what Michelle Murphy did offer, which gave her a claim to a share in the accomplishments of those who were her friends. Thank you.
Wasn't she a person worth hearing about? So our next speaker is Jessa Crick, who was the senior research assistant on the project. Prior to her coming to the project, she was the collections assistant at the Costume Institute at the Metropolitan Museum, and prior to that, she was an assistant in the Rati Textile Center there. Jessa received her BA from Willamette University in Salem, Oregon, and an MA in the history of decorative arts at the Bard Graduate Center here in New York. She's going to tell us about maybe one of the truly first-time discoveries that we made in the project. So come up, Jessa.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak to you this afternoon, and thank you, Jan, for your introduction and the invitation to speak to friends and colleagues here at the symposium. Today, I'd like to talk about my discoveries related to a very special group of objects which are part of the Brooklyn Museum costume collection. This research truly began with the methodical process of cataloging objects during the Brooklyn Costume Documentation Project. It was inspired directly by observations which were made about garments as they were examined and evaluated. During this process, one particular accession number group caught the attention of the team over and over again. The group had the accession number 67.110, and the donor was Mrs. Frederick H. Prince, Jr. Frequently, when an object from this group moved through the cataloging process, it was identified as a highlight of the collection, part of the so-called Special 4000, which you have heard about today. This group of garments proved to be a revelatory collection within a collection, and one of the unexpected gems of the Brooklyn Museum costume collection. The large group donated by Mrs. Prince in 1967 is comprised of over 400 objects. The list of designers represented included many big names: Pekin, Doucet, Lanvin, Vianney, and others. Here are three examples from the gift. Pekin from 1895, the pink dress. In the center, Doucet from 1902, and Jean Hallé from 1903, a day dress on the near side here. The gift also included pieces by virtually unknown designers. These, and even the objects without labels in the group, proved to be examples of the highest quality of fashionable goods available during a period spanning nearly a century. The earliest pieces date from the mid-19th century, and here are two of those 19th century examples, both by unknown makers. This is a wool dressing gown from about 1885 and a bonnet from 1880 with the full body of the bird featured there. The collection includes luxurious goods such as this leopard fur foot warmer from about 1900 and the embroidered shoes, which were my introductory image as well, from 1875. And the latest pieces in the group date from the 1930s. These are two Lanvins, both from 1937. As I said, part of the latest objects from the group. While the garments and accessories represented the impeccable taste and significant wealth of their owners, their history as a collection was far from clear at the start of the documentation project. Very little information about the donor or her family came to the museum with this gift. There was no background information in any part of the museum archives apart from just a very few short sort of correspondence, letters, really more short notes from Mrs. Prince, and no notes about who might have selected, purchased, or wore the garments accompanied them into the collection. But still, the quality of the garments called for additional research. In the end, the objects merited the time and effort which is ongoing, spent to investigate them. I began my research initially by looking into the Prince family and immediately discovered intriguing biographical details about one of America's elite families. Elite, but far lesser known than others at their same social level. I began to construct a timeline of the Prince family dates and milestones, returning to the objects as the cataloging process continued and more of these special garments were discovered. This is a very abbreviated version of the timeline, just showing the major players. The gift happened in 1967, and then Virginia Mitchell Higginson, their marriage date, and the parents of the respective couple. I delved into Mrs. Frederick Prince Jr.'s own biography and her family history in an effort to discover if the garments might have come from her mother, or other relatives on her side of the family. Mrs. Prince Jr. was also Virginia Mitchell and Mrs. James Jackson Higginson at other points in her life. And since there are two Mrs. Princes in this story, I'll refer to the donor as Virginia and to her mother-in-law as Mrs. Prince. This is a brand new discovery in my research, the only picture I have found so far of Virginia. Here she is in Vogue. This is a story about fox hunting in Virginia, which appeared in December 1940. And this is Virginia in the dark riding habit, and her friend, Mrs. Grafton Pine, in the leopard. One piece from a second, smaller gift that Virginia made to the Brooklyn Museum in 1987 opened the door to the possibility that not all the garments came from a single source. This object was an engraved pocket watch given to Bessie Young, the beloved longtime nurse and nanny for Virginia's family, the Mitchells. While Virginia's family enjoyed a comfortable standard of living at Pembroke, which was their estate in Far Hills, New Jersey, her father, Clarence Blair Mitchell, never inherited the money from the fortune left by his great-grandfather, who was a railroad magnate named John Inslee Blair. While I still suspect that some of the more modest pieces in Virginia's gift may have been worn by her mother, Lucy Mildred Matthews, the majority of the couture garments are more suited to the lifestyle of the Princes, in particular, Virginia's in-laws, the senior Mr. and Mrs. Prince. Virginia Mitchell Higginson married into the Prince family in 1935. She was the second wife of Frederick Henry Prince, Jr. Jr. was the eldest son of Frederick Henry Prince, and that's the gentleman shown here. Prince was a shrewd financier who amassed a fortune through his own brokerage firm, and then by diversifying with railroads and stockyards. Prince preserved his fortune during the stock market crash of 1929 and amassed even greater wealth in the 1930s. He was an owner of the Union Stockyards in Chicago, and he also purchased Armour and Company and quickly built it into one of the largest companies in the United States at the time. Armour and Company was a slaughterhouse and stockyard, but when you think about all the commercial consumer goods that were made out of animal byproducts, including soaps, fertilizers, natural bristles for hairbrushes and things like that, you can see how that wealth came about, or was added to with that acquisition. The Princes purchased Marble House in Newport, Rhode Island from Alva Vanderbilt. By then, she was Mrs. Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont in 1932. And the Prince family spent the summer there each year. Father and son are frequently mentioned in the press as participants in yacht races, tennis matches, polo matches, et cetera, et cetera. The family also maintained a home in Boston, an estate in Essex County outside of Boston, a home in South Carolina, and abroad, homes in Biarritz and in Pau, France. There's even some evidence of the Prince men in the gift. This is an ascot tie from a French maker, and it's embroidered with Frederick Sr.'s monogram. With these clues about the Prince's wealth, my attention turned to Mrs. Prince, the mother-in-law of Virginia, and the most likely candidate for the ownership of the couture garments in the gift. Some of the connections were very obvious. Several petticoats and drawers bear the married monogram of Mrs. Prince. Abigail Kinsley Norman married Frederick Prince in 1884. Abigail's family resided in Boston, Newport. They had a home in New York, and also Paradise Farm in Rhode Island. By 1894, which is 10 years after her marriage, Abigail was identified as a social leader in New York. This petticoat and others in the collection bear her embroidered monogram, AP for Abigail Prince. She was also known as Abby. This piece is a cream and light blue evening dress, and it retains the label of a little-known designer, Raoul Lafontaine, with a POW address. The gown easily could have been purchased during a trip to the Prince family home there. And although the designer's name is not well known, the dress is really a tour de force of couture workmanship. It's made out of a striped textile with a blue satin stripe, and then a chiffon, in between, so it looks like ribbons laid across the fabric. And the upper part of the skirt has been pleated, and so it's only when you get to the sort of V shape where the pleats are released that you see the nature of the textile and how it's been worked to look like a different textile in the upper part of the skirt. This is the tassel dress. Other examples of Mrs. Prince's clothing, like this one, attest to her elegance and good taste. This beaded gown is a really remarkable piece. It has no label in it, but the beadwork really made it stand out for us as it came through the cataloging area. It has true three-dimensional tassels in the upper trim of the bodice, but the tassel work on the skirt is accomplished completely through beading, so it has a trompe-l'oeil effect of the open work. It looks like it has a tasseled overdress over the columnar skirt, completely accomplished through the beading. Other items in the collection quietly represent the grief Mrs. Prince experienced in her lifetime. Her mother died in 1915, followed by her son the following year, in 1916. Norman Prince was the younger of her two sons, and he sustained fatal injuries while flying a mission with the Lafayette Escadrille. This was the American Volunteer Flying Corps attached to the French forces in the early part of the First World War. He was a real hero of the First War. There's quite a bit of information about his exploits. These mourning hats would have been highly fashionable and appropriate mourning attire for both of these sad occasions. The Prince family fortune ensured Mrs. Prince's wardrobe included a great deal of couture, and perhaps Virginia's did too after she married into the Prince fortune. This gown by Suzanne Talbot from circa 1925 is a highlight of the high style show here at the Brooklyn Museum. And it speaks to a woman who is aware of the transformation of styles in the 1920s. Mrs. Prince would have been in her 60s in the 1920s, but the labels in the garments from this time period indicate that she was still very much a couture client in that decade. One such garment resulted in a favorite story from the cataloging project. At some point, long before the cataloging began, the two pieces of this dress became separated and were stored apart from each other at the Brooklyn Museum. The sheer outer dress with its dramatic hemline and delicate drawn work at the shoulder seams and at the sleeve ends was cataloged with the 1920s garments and identified as incomplete. But Jan, myself, and the other research assistants could not ignore the quality of the garment and kept it in mind as we examined slips and underdresses later in the project. We all enjoyed a eureka moment when dress and underdress were reunited. Both pieces are of similar quality. They aligned perfectly when placed together on a dress form and matched the brief original cataloging description. The label in the underdress? That of Lucien Lelong, a designer known for his modern sensibility. While the dress is in keeping with the prevailing styles of the 1920s, the cut and severity also suggest an artistic sensibility for the woman who selected and wore it. She probably would have been someone who would appreciate its austerity and its angularity and the inventive design of this piece. While the precise reasons why Mrs. Prince chose the Brooklyn Museum as a home for her collection of family garments have been lost, the gift greatly enhanced the holdings of the costume collection at the Brooklyn Museum. The gift brought a large number of couture pieces in excellent condition into the department. Even among world-class collections, the list of donors for such a large group of singular examples of French couture and custom American garments is a short one. You will all have seen examples from the Prince gift in the High Style exhibition today, although you may not have known about the Prince family until this afternoon. As you have an opportunity to explore the American Woman Show at the Met tomorrow, I encourage you to look closely at the exhibition labels and note how frequently Prince garments appear in the select group on view there. As a result of the costume documentation project, the gift of Mrs. Frederick H. Prince, Jr., and those of so many others are now reaching a new audience in these exhibitions. And undoubtedly, they will be part of future installations and continue to inspire research and new discovery in years to come. Thank you.
And finally, Jessica Rawl was also a research assistant on the project, and she was the collection management assistant at the Elizabeth Sage Historic Costume Collection before coming to the project. She holds a Bachelor of Science in Apparel Merchandising, an Associate of Science in Costume Construction Technology, and a Master of Science in Collection Management. And Jessica is going to tell us in more detail about the wonderful French mannequins made for the Gratitude Train.
In 1949, the Brooklyn Museum received a gift of 49 fashion mannequins created by the Chambre Syndicale, representing a timeline of the history of French fashion. The mannequins were part of the Gratitude Train, a gesture of appreciation for aid sent to France from the United States in the aftermath of World War II. Instead of dividing them amongst the states as originally planned, the Chambre gave the entire group to the Brooklyn Museum so that they could remain united and be appreciated for what they are, a singular example of French craftsmanship and design ingenuity. In 1947, Drew Pearson, a syndicated Washington political columnist and radio personality, voiced the idea that America should come to the aid of war-torn France and Italy. As word spread across the country, the project grew until 700 boxcars were filled with $40 million worth of supplies, far exceeding their original goals. After traveling across the country to gather individual contributions, the boxcars were shipped out of New York, arriving in Le Havre in December of 1947. The following year, the people of France, moved to action by this gesture of goodwill, wished to express their gratitude. Like the American Friendship Train, the Gratitude Train relied on the generosity of individuals. They arrived in droves to donation centers bearing gifts. It was decided that 49 boxcars would be sent to the United States. Each state would receive one car, with Washington, D.C. and the territory of Hawaii sharing the 49th. Each boxcar and every gift inside of it was labeled with the emblem of the Gratitude Train, an image of the front of a train with flowers representing Flanders Field, a cemetery where 411 American servicemen who fell in a battle in the closing days of World War II are buried. Individuals were encouraged to donate anything they could give. Children made drawings or sacrificed beloved toys. People gave hand-crocheted doilies and ashtrays made from broken mirror. Along with the humble gifts from individuals, priceless works of art and historical artifacts were included. Amongst these treasures were a bust of Benjamin Franklin by Jean-Antoine Houdin, a Légion d'honneur insignia presented to Napoleon, a Louis XV carriage, the first motorcycle ever built, and 50 rare paintings, to name just a few. A walking stick belonging to the Marquis de Lafayette was given by one of his ancestors. The city of Lian provided dozens of silk wedding dresses, and an anonymous man gave a set of black lingerie he intended for, quote, a beautiful blonde. According to newspaper reports, one woman, too poor to provide anything of material value, rushed to one of the freshly painted cars saying, quote, "I have nothing else to send. I will send them my fingerprints," as she pressed her fingers into the wet paint. The donations were so abundant that over 9,000 gifts had to be left behind. The boxcars were loaded on the merchant ship Magellan, leaving Havre and arriving in New York Harbor in February of 1949. Over 200,000 people attended the New York celebration, welcoming the train, which included a ticker tape parade, as the New York boxcar was taken up Broadway in Manhattan. Once the boxcars arrived in the United States, they were divided into direction to the South, West, and New England, and placed on flat cars as they were too wide for American rails. Each state organized committees to catalog the contents of their cars. Many of the gifts were auctioned for charity, while others were given to museums and libraries. Some gifts, such as an engraved Joan of Arc bell, included instructions for distribution. The city of Annecy cast the 500-pound bell as a gift to Cardinal Spilman with the inscription, quote, "I am the ambassadress that sings of gratitude and friendship." Cardinal Spilman gave the bell to St. Patrick's Cathedral here in New York. Unfortunately, Hawaii, which was at the time still a territory, and had donated 2 carloads full of sugar on the American Friendship train, shared their car with Washington, D.C. When the Hawaiians received their shared boxcar, they were surprised to find it full only of packing straw. The car had been completely emptied in Washington, D.C., leaving only the boxcar itself as their gift. I know, poor Hawaii. The Chambre Syndicale, who had to raise money for the French people, had 2 years prior organized the Théâtre de la Mode, a group of fashion mannequins dressed in clothing from the 1947 Couture collections, chose to create a new set of mannequins, this time representing the evolution of French fashion rather than the current season. Once again, the Chambre tapped their most talented and well-known fashion designers, hairstylists, and accessory designers of the time to create these mannequins. Each house designed one ensemble representing an era in fashion from 1715 to 1906. The inspiration for these historic fashions came from fine art as well as contemporaneous fashion plates. The unique design of the fashion mannequin was conceived by Eileen Bonnabel and the plaster head by the artist Raboul. Each mannequin measures approximately 24 inches tall, taller depending on the hairstyle, with bodies made entirely of open wire. The hairstyles were rendered in human hair wigs. And this is an image of the seamstresses from the House of Lanvin finishing their mannequin. Marcel Rochat took inspiration for his dress from the painting L'Ossagne de Jussin by Jean-Antoine Watteau. Watteau's signature was the fête galante, a genre characterized by outdoor parties and bucolic scenes. This work was created for the shop of his friend and art dealer, Jussin, where it is believed to have hung in the window as a sign, hence the name. In addition to being an interesting study of everyday life in an art dealer's shop, it highlights the artist's favored style of female dress. The fashionable women in Watteau's fête galante were so often depicting wearing the style that they became known as Watteau pleats, though the style was certainly not exclusive to his work. Rochat's interpretation of the early 18th century style depicts the popular mantua gown. The loose bodice and skirt of the overdress open at the front to expose the petticoat and stomacher, and the skirt is gathered at the back and sides to create hip drapery. In this mannequin, the figured satin mantua skirt is pulled up at hip level with satin bows. Down to her coquettish patch, the 1715 mannequin embodies the opulence and splendor of Watteau's works and 18th century France. Molyneux's contribution to the Gratitude Train, representing 1762, was reportedly inspired by a portrait of Madame de Pompadour by de la Tour. Maurice Quentin de la Tour was the French portrait artist to King Louis XV of France from 1750 to 1773. During his tenure, one of his many subjects was that of Madame de Pompadour, the official mistress of Louis XV. The mannequin by Molyneux is not a direct interpretation of this gown Pompadour wears in the de la Tour painting, but in fact resembles a composite of portraits by de la Tour as well as Boucher, who painted Madame Pompadour many times. Madame Pompadour by de la Tour depicts her in her home surrounded by books and works of art alluding to her desire to enlighten the French court with the intellectual developments of Parisian culture at the time. Perhaps Molyneux's mannequin was meant to pay tribute to this specific woman's contribution to French culture instead of interpreting one specific gown. Les Adieux by Jean-Michel Moreau provided the inspiration for the 1774 mannequin. Moreau le Jeune, as he was known for his illustrations recording fashionable dress and interiors. The original work of art is now housed in the Metropolitan Museum of Art's collection. Jean Dessay interpreted the V-shaped bodice in black velvet. The elaborate hairstyle and headdress are particularly notable in this mannequin, as well as the scaled rendering of the metallic braid embroidery in the satin skirt. Another work by Moreau le Jeune provided inspiration for the 1779 mannequin by Lucille Maguin. Le Rendezvous pour Marly, like Les Adieux, was part of the Monument du Costume, a series of engravings depicting the fashionable dress and interiors of the Ancien Régime. The mannequin and engraving highlight the Polonaise gown's most recognizable feature, a skirt drawn up to create 3 draped puffs around the hips. This fashionable interpretation of middle-class dress had a practical feature, lifting the long overskirt to the ankle, making walking in the city streets significantly easier. The art of Lawrence Alma Tadema provided the inspiration for the House of Lanvin's contribution to the Gratitude Train. Alma Tadema was a Dutch-born painter who later settled in England and was one of the most renowned artists in the late 19th century. He painted classical subjects, most often scenes of luxurious Roman Empire. Known for his meticulous research, Alma Tadema's paintings were used in the 20th century as source material for several Hollywood movies, including Ben-Hur, Cleopatra, The Ten Commandments, and Gladiator. The individual work of art is not identified, but these 2 paintings, The Coin of Vantage and Unconscious Rivals, illustrate the graceful draping and brilliant colors for which he was known. And you can see Lanvin translated this in striking contrast between the black and rose taffetas and decorative hip draping. It is worth noting that Lanvin was the only house to choose an artist who was not French. The designers and dressmakers took great care and went to considerable trouble to make these creations, but it was not only the couturiers who contributed to their creation. The mannequin by Elsa Schiaparelli, whose detail you see here, representing the year 1906, featured high-heeled calfskin boots with functional jet buttons closures made by Perugia, Schiaparelli's favored shoemaker. Galincas and Bergère showed incredible care and attention to detail in their shoes for the 1855 mannequin. The suede wingtip foxing is rendered in minute detail on these boots for the ensemble by Vera Borea. Many of the seamstresses also went above and beyond in their construction. The 1774 mannequin by Dessay wears a cream taffeta petticoat under her skirt with steel pannier hoops trimmed in black velvet ribbon over cotton drawers. This is the image on your left. A detail that would have gone unnoticed to most viewers, but through the infinite wisdom of our conservator Glenn, we have images of all of these. Under the gown by Marcel Dormoy on your right, the mannequin wears finely crafted mole pantaloons trimmed in a double layer of Valenciennes lace. The exquisite construction of the Gratitude Train's mannequins is a testament to the French legacy of superior craftsmanship as well as design. The mannequins didn't just represent the historical periods, but the designers themselves. Though Lanvin passed away a few years before the Gratitude Train, her house continued under the direction of her daughter, but their afternoon dress has the characteristics of a Lanvin creation, as well as Balenciaga's afternoon ensemble, which is distinctive as well in this regard. His affection for white satin is clear in this mannequin representing 1870. The dress also happens to be inspired by a gown designed for Princess Metternich, who was a great patron of the arts. Not only does this collection represent the history of French fashion and art, but the history of the French woman, from the 18th century fête gallant aristocrats to the bloomer-wearing 20th century woman. The Brooklyn Museum was chosen as the repository for the gratitude-trained mannequins because of its contribution to the design industry. As you've heard before from Katie about the importance of the design lab, it created a center of study for fashion design professionals. It was an opportunity to exchange ideas and draw inspiration from the vast collections of the Brooklyn Museum. Their transfer now to the Metropolitan Museum of Art signifies new opportunities for the study and appreciation of these miniature masterpieces. Thank you.